Some days begin with such quiet promise, so steeped in grace and order, that they feel immune to disruption. That morning, in the soft hush of sunrise over Seattle's bustling international terminal, Danielle Carter believed she was walking into one of those days. Dressed in an emerald green travel coat that fluttered gently with her steps, Danielle moved through the terminal with a practiced calm. Her husband Elijah walked slightly ahead with their son Miles and daughter Leah, flanking either side, each child clinging to their small airbag and a tightly folded first-class boarding pass. They weren't new to travel. The Carters had flown countless times, sometimes private, sometimes commercial, but always together, always as a unit. Leah, the younger of the two at just 7, wore a headband adorned with satin butterflies. She clutched her plush bunny by one ear, her eyes wide with excitement. Miles, 10, walked with the quiet confidence of a boy raised to know his worth. He tapped at his smartwatch and asked casually, "Do you think we'll get the seats with the little lamps?" Danielle smiled and gently squeezed his shoulder. "I think so, honey. This is a long flight. We'll want all the little comforts." Their presence turned heads, though not in the way some might expect. There was no flashiness, no flamboyance. The Carters exuded what could only be described as quiet excellence, an energy that spoke of earned dignity, not performative prestige. And perhaps that was why, when the family stepped into the first-class cabin of Westward Airlines Flight 407, their very presence unsettled more than just a few unspoken assumptions. Danielle helped Leah into her seat beside the window, while Elijah stowed their carry-ons in the overhead bin. The cabin around them hummed with the subdued elegance of luxury travel, muted lighting, champagne flutes on linen-trimmed trays, and the low murmur of boarding passengers taking their seats. Then came the change. It began with a shadow. Out of the corner of her eye, Danielle saw the unmistakable silhouette of a flight attendant approaching from the galley. Tall, angular, and immaculately groomed in a navy blazer with a silver wing pin, the woman wore a smile so taut it barely concealed the tension underneath. "Excuse me, ma'am," the woman said, stopping just beside Danielle's seat. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to a seat in the back. We've had a reallocation." Danielle blinked, at first thinking she had misheard. "I'm sorry?" "There's been a manifest adjustment," the woman repeated, her voice clipped. "I'll need you to gather your things and proceed to seat 27B in the economy. No explanation, no apology, no request, only command." Danielle froze. For a beat, her body refused to react. Her hand instinctively moved to Leah's, still nestled against her armrest. Elijah, just returning to his seat across the aisle, paused mid-step. "There must be a mistake," Danielle said evenly. "This is my assigned seat. We booked these together." But the woman whose name tag read R. Foster merely narrowed her eyes. "Ma'am, I need you to comply." The surrounding passengers, most of whom had been shifting coats or adjusting bags, stopped mid-motion. A man in a business suit looked up from his tablet. A woman sipping sparkling water lowered her glass slowly. Silence, thick and expectant, flooded the cabin. Danielle looked at Elijah. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His jaw tightened just slightly, his gaze locking with hers in a flash of concern, not confusion. Because they both knew what this was. And it wasn't a seating error. With dignified precision, Danielle unfastened her seatbelt. She leaned down to press a kiss to Leah's forehead and whispered something only her daughter could hear. The little girl's eyes welled up, but she nodded bravely. Miles's grip on his backpack tightened. Danielle stood, and the moment she did, the fabric of the cabin shifted. The weight of the injustice settled not just on her shoulders, but across every person seated in that room of hushed affluence. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about something deeper, something that moved beneath the skin. As Danielle walked past the rows of luxury seats, her heels clicking softly against the carpet, the silence held. Not one passenger said a word. Not one offered resistance or solidarity. Their eyes followed her, but their mouths remained sealed. Behind her, Rachel Foster stood unmoved, face unreadable. Elijah exhaled through his nose and sat down slowly in his seat, eyes on the front of the cabin. He didn't speak, not yet. Instead, he reached for his phone, and in that stillness, a vow was made. this wasn't over. Elijah Carter had always believed in restraint, not the kind born from fear, but the kind forged through discipline. As a CEO, he knew the price of speaking too soon. As a black man in corporate America, he knew the cost of speaking too loudly. But sitting in seat 2C, watching his wife disappear down the aisle, something inside him began to split quietly. He didn't call after Danielle. He didn't demand answers. Instead, he opened his phone. The screen lit up with calm familiarity. No panic in his fingertips. No trembling. Just deliberate, precise motion as he navigated through a secured channel. An encrypted thread used only for executive-level emergencies within Westward Holdings, the parent company of Westward Airlines. It was a network built not for drama, but for decisive course correction. Elijah had never used it for personal reasons. Until now. He began typing. Immediate compliance review requested for in-flight crew behavior. Passenger, Danielle Carter. Flight 407, unauthorized downgrade. Video confirmation in progress. Request escalation to board-level ethics committee. The moment the message was sent, Elijah's thumb hovered briefly over the screen. Then, with the serenity of a man who understood the storm he'd just summoned, he locked his phone and looked out the window. From 35,000 feet, the world below seemed small. But Elijah knew that what had happened moments ago, this small, almost silent assault on his family's dignity, was anything but small. Across the aisle, Miles clutched his stuffed backpack, legs swinging above the floor. He didn't ask any questions. His silence was loud enough. Leah, still seated by the window, pressed her face to the glass, pretending to be excited by clouds she no longer cared about. The innocence of their expressions carved deeper than any spoken confrontation. Elijah leaned slightly toward them and whispered, "Mom's okay. She's just letting them show who they are." When it finally came, I was quiet and unsure. Why did she have to move? Didn't we do everything right? Elijah hesitated, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he had too many. He chose the simplest truth. Sometimes, even when you do everything right, people still try to put you in the wrong place. But they don't get the last word. Ever. Meanwhile, in the back of the plane, Danielle Carter sat wedged between two strangers. The seat didn't recline fully. Her knees brushed the tray table. A faint scent of reheated food hung in the air. But it wasn't the physical discomfort that struck her. It was the message. A message she had received her entire life in 1,000 different forms. "You don't belong here." She stared ahead, her posture straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her silence was not submission. It was resistance with steel beneath it. And though she couldn't see her husband, she knew Elijah was already moving pieces. That was the quiet strength of their bond. He would not erupt, he would not grandstand, but he would strike, and the blow would not be forgotten. Back in first class, Rachel Foster moved through the aisle with mechanical grace, offering drinks with a too-wide smile, avoiding eye contact with Elijah. But her body betrayed her, a slight tremble in the wrist. The stiffness of someone unsure if she had just committed a minor policy infraction or a career-defining mistake. She passed Elijah without a word. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. Across the aisle, Ava Morgan, the junior flight attendant, observed everything. She had witnessed the exchange earlier. Ms. Foster's sudden decision, the abrupt dismissal, the quiet sorrow in Danielle's expression. It had unsettled her. She had seen many seating adjustments in her brief career, but none like this. None with such cold finality, and certainly none targeting a woman whose poise and presence radiated so clearly that she belonged in first class more than any diamond-level cardholder. Ava knew the manifest hadn't changed. She'd seen it, and Danielle Carter's name had always been listed. Row 2, Seat B. As she passed Elijah's row, Ava slowed slightly and gently set down a glass of still water on the side tray without being asked. It was a simple gesture, but it landed like thunder. Elijah nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Ava moved on. At the rear of the plane, Danielle heard whispers. A woman 2 rows back murmured something to her husband. A teenager subtly lifted her phone, pretending to scroll while angling the lens. Danielle didn't flinch. She had long ago learned that in moments like this, the truest dignity is found in stillness. It wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't a clerical error. It was a message. But Danielle Carter had never accepted messages written by other people's prejudice, and she wouldn't start now. Back in the cockpit, Captain Douglas Pierce received a discreet alert on his side monitor. High priority executive flag. Passenger incident, Flight 407. He frowned and tapped for details. The message was direct. Compliance escalation initiated. The passenger was improperly reassigned. Watch for internal audit. Captain Pierce didn't know the full story yet, but he had flown long enough to recognize a line being crossed, and he didn't enjoy flying blind. He turned to the intercom and said quietly, "Ms. Foster, report to the flight deck, please." The tone of his voice, flat but final, hung in the air. Rachel Foster paused mid-step, her expression stiffening, and suddenly the first fracture of accountability began to splinter the surface of the quiet injustice. Elijah exhaled slowly. Danielle adjusted the crease of her skirt, and somewhere far beneath them, the world kept turning, unaware that high above, the wind had just begun to change direction. Rachel Foster hated being summoned, especially mid-flight. As the intercom clicked off and Captain Pierce's quiet command still echoed in her ears, she smoothed the front of her uniform with trembling fingers. It wasn't fear, at least that's what she told herself. It was protocol. She had done her job, followed the rules, asserted control where control was needed. Yet as she stepped toward the cockpit, eyes followed her. Passengers didn't say anything, but the silence she passed through was no longer indifferent. It was watchful and judgmental. Behind her, Elijah Carter remained seated in 2C, one leg crossed, fingers laced gently over his knee. He hadn't moved since the captain's announcement, hadn't spoken to anyone, but his stillness was purposeful, a fortress of calm waiting to collapse inward with explosive precision. The cockpit door clicked open. "Step inside and close the door behind you," Captain Pierce said, not looking up from the flight monitor. Rachel obeyed, swallowing hard. The hum of instruments filled the confined space like a second heartbeat. The co-pilot gave her a brief nod, but kept his attention on the controls. Captain Pierce finally turned, his aviator sunglasses now removed, revealing gray eyes honed by decades in the sky and an even longer tenure observing human behavior. He motioned for her to take the jump seat. She did, sitting upright, shoulders squared. "What happened in first class?" he asked simply. Rachel's throat tightened. "There was a manifest discrepancy. I was told—" He raised a single hand, halting her. "Were you told by the gate team?" he asked. "No," she replied slowly. "But the manifest indicated—" "Did you cross-check it on your tablet before moving the passenger?" Rachel hesitated, because the truth was she hadn't. There had been no alert, no reallocation notice. She'd seen the Carter family boarding, seen Danielle's graceful presence, the confident way she'd taken her seat beside her daughter, and something inside her had bristled. The ease, the assurance, the unspoken claim to a space that some still refused to believe people like Danielle belonged in. "I assumed there was an error," Rachel finally said. Captain Pierce leaned forward. "You assumed. You didn't verify." The silence that followed was suffocating. Rachel blinked, searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. "Sir, I believed there was a seating issue that required immediate resolution. And that resolution involved moving a single mother from her assigned seat in first class, without checking, without explanation, and in front of her family." Rachel's lips parted, but no words came. The captain picked up a tablet from the dashboard and turned it toward her. On the screen, clear as crystal, was the passenger manifest. Danielle Carter. Seat 2B confirmed. No change. No override. "She was where she was supposed to be," he said evenly, "and you weren't." For the first time, Rachel's posture faltered. Captain Pierce continued. "Do you know who's seated in 2C? I didn't check." "You should have. His name is Elijah Carter. Ring a bell?" Rachel frowned. The name sounded vaguely familiar. The captain let the silence build, then delivered the truth with precision. "Mr. Carter is the CEO of Westward Holdings. He signs your paycheck." Rachel's eyes widened. A full beat passed before she could find her voice. I didn't know. I didn't realize—" "Didn't realize what, Miss Foster?" the captain asked, eyes narrowing. That the black woman you ordered to the back of the plane was married to one of the most powerful men in this company? Or that she had every legal and moral right to her seat? Rachel sat frozen, words collapsing inside her. The captain continued, his tone sharpening. It's not the mistake that concerns me most. It's how easily you made it, how quickly you acted without checking the facts, without explaining compassion. The words struck harder than Rachel had expected. Because they weren't laced with anger, they were laced with disappointment, and that stung more. He handed her a small earpiece. You'll escort Mrs. Carter back to first class immediately. Apologize. Publicly. Rachel stared at the device as if it were a live wire. And when we land, he added, you'll be debriefed by corporate security. The executive ethics team is already waiting. Outside the cockpit, the tension in the cabin grew sharper by the second. Danielle, still seated between two strangers in row 27B, could feel the shift in the air. She didn't look up when the door to the cockpit opened. She didn't have to. The rhythm of movement, the forced calm of someone about to fall apart, was unmistakable. Rachel Foster stood before her, barely managing composure. Mrs. Carter, she began, voice quieter than usual, I need to ask you to return to your original seat in first class. There's been a misunderstanding. Danielle met her gaze with calm precision. Is that what we're calling it? The surrounding passengers shifted in their seats. Rachel's throat bobbed. I apologize. Danielle rose slowly, gathering her coat and small handbag. She turned to the man beside her, an older gentleman who had offered her a bottle of water in silent sympathy earlier. Excuse me, she said gently. As she stepped into the aisle, the hush deepened. People didn't clap. They didn't cheer. But they watched. And some, with heads bowed slightly, acknowledged what they were witnessing. Not a mistake. A reckoning. Rachel trailed behind her, each step heavier than the last. And Elijah, watching his wife return with elegance undimmed, simply unlocked his phone. The second message had already been drafted. Now he simply pressed send. As Danielle walked back up the aisle toward her rightful seat in first class, a slow, collective awareness settled over the cabin. Passengers watched not with idle curiosity now, but with something closer to shame and reverence. The silence was no longer hollow. It was thick with implication, with regret, with reckoning. Danielle moved with the calm grace of someone who had nothing to prove, only truth to carry. She wasn't smiling, but neither did she scowl. Her expression was that of a woman who had chosen to rise above humiliation, not out of politeness, but out of power. When she reached row 2, Leah stood instinctively, arms reaching upward. Mama, the little girl whispered, eyes wide with hope. Danielle knelt slightly and embraced her daughter, holding her close, letting her feel that nothing new forced separation, no act of cold authority, had changed what mattered. I told you I'd be back, Danielle whispered. Miles, still seated beside Elijah, looked up at his mother with a mixture of pride and quiet confusion. Elijah reached across his lap and gently brushed Danielle's hand as she settled back into seat 2B. Their fingers met only for a second, but it was enough. Rachel Foster stood just behind, stiff and pale. Would you like anything to drink, Mrs. Carter? She asked weakly, the script of hospitality struggling to find a place in a moment that had outgrown her authority. Danielle turned slightly, her voice soft but clear. No, thank you. But I would like to say something. The words weren't directed at the flight attendant. They were directed to everyone. Rachel blinked, unsure of protocol. She looked toward the jump seat, toward Ava, toward anyone who might tell her what to do. But no one spoke, because everyone was listening now. Danielle slowly unfastened her belt again, stood up, and faced the cabin. I know many of you witnessed what happened earlier, she began, her voice level. Some of you saw me ask, without reason, to leave my seat. Some of you probably thought it must be a mistake. Others maybe thought nothing at all. A ripple moved through the rows. What you may not have realized, and she continued, is that my seat was paid for, confirmed, and correctly assigned. There was no error, no reallocation, no policy at play. She paused. What there was an assumption that I didn't belong. Not because of what I did or what I failed to do, but simply because of who I am. Her words were not laced with bitterness. They didn't need to be. My daughter, she gestured to Leah, was made to watch me be removed from her side. My son, she nodded at Miles, asked if we'd done something wrong. And I, like far too many others before me, was put in the position of teaching my children in real time how to survive being silently disrespected. From the rear of the cabin, a small digital chime went off, a phone receiving a message. Then another, a murmur. A young woman in row 4 was recording. So was an older man across the aisle. Danielle didn't flinch. I'm not here to cause a scene. I'm here to make sure this doesn't get buried. And with that, she sat down again. There was no applause, just silence. But this time, the silence was not avoidance. It was recognition. Back in the cockpit, Captain Pierce received another alert. Viral content detected. Passenger video exceeding 25K views. Internal PR escalation required. He inhaled slowly. On the ground, phones began ringing inside the offices of Westward Airlines. A young intern in corporate communications watched the trending hashtags climb. Trun First Class, Bias, Shakshun, Danielle Carter, Sharkshun, She Belonged. There, Westward Watch. Within 30 minutes, Danielle's video, barely 2 minutes long, had spread across social platforms. The footage wasn't edited. It didn't need music or filters. Just her voice, her posture, her dignity. In the center of the quiet chaos, Rachel Foster stood in the galley, gripping the beverage cart like a lifeline. Her breathing had grown shallow. She could hear snippets of whispered judgment now, passengers murmuring, not kindly, not forgiving. She turned to Ava Morgan, who had just returned from assisting a family in row 9. Do you think this will go away? Rachel asked, her voice raw. Ava didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply said, no, and it shouldn't. Rachel's hand slipped from the cart. She suddenly felt the weight of her name tag pressing like iron against her chest. In first class, Elijah's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Sheldon Grant, the airline's operations executive liaison. Elijah, we're aware. Crisis protocol initiated. We're reviewing your statement request and will be convening an emergency board meeting within the hour. Please advise. Elijah typed back one line. Make it public, make it real, or we will. He set the phone down and looked at Danielle. She didn't need to ask. He nodded. And in that moment, the shift became irreversible. This wasn't just a viral moment. It was a movement, and it had just taken flight. Thousands of feet above the Pacific, Flight 407 continued on its smooth trajectory toward New York. But inside the plane, the turbulence wasn't in the air. It was in the atmosphere of revelation. Danielle Carter sat once again in seat 2B, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the seat in front of her. She hadn't spoken since her address to the cabin. She didn't need to. Her silence now spoke louder than any broadcast. Across the aisle, Elijah quietly reviewed the message traffic on his phone. The video of Danielle had surpassed 100,000 views in under 20 minutes. Prominent journalists had already reposted it. Activists and nonprofit leaders were calling for accountability. One senator had even retweeted the clip with the words, unacceptable, familiar, and fixable, if we choose to fix it. But the most pressing alert had come moments ago, from inside. Internal. Board members are assembling. Legal is involved. PR is requesting a direct statement from Mr. Carter and Mrs. Carter. Back at the airline's Manhattan headquarters, a sleek glass tower that often prided itself on its unshakable image, the executive floor was in chaos. Inside a polished conference room, 12 individuals sat around an oval table, their expressions stiff with discomfort. A projection screen at the far end displayed Danielle's video on loop. The room was uncomfortably silent as they watched her speak again. Her tone wasn't angry. It wasn't emotional in the traditional sense. It was controlled, composed, unapologetically honest, and that terrified them. She didn't raise her voice, the HR director muttered almost to herself. She didn't threaten anyone. She didn't even say the word racism. She didn't need to, said the brand communications lead, his arms crossed. The world filled it in for her. The CEO of the airline, a sharp-featured man in his 50s named Malcolm Reed, ran his hand down his tie. He had worked with Elijah Carter for 5 years. He knew the man didn't seek drama. If anything, Elijah had always been the picture of executive restraint. Quiet, brilliant, impossible to fluster. This meant that if he was speaking now, things would already be far worse than they appeared. "Get Elijah on a call," Malcolm instructed. "We need to contain this before it spins further." But it was already spinning. Back on the plane, Ava Morgan stood quietly in the front galley, her hand resting on the countertop as if grounding herself. She had served under Rachel Foster for 3 years. Rachel had always been a stickler for procedure. Polished, strict, but never before had Ava seen her crack. Until now. Rachel sat in the rear galley, her hands shaking slightly as she reviewed a crumpled manifest that no longer offered her protection. The weight of her decision had taken on a new shape. Consequence. Passengers whispered as they passed. No one offered her a smile. Her uniform, once a shield of professionalism, now clung to her like a confession. Meanwhile, a teenage girl in row 5, inspired by Danielle's words, pulled out her phone and began typing a caption under a photo she had taken. "I watched a black woman get removed from her seat with no explanation. I watched her return with grace, and still not one person from the crew acknowledged the harm. This is what injustice looks like when it wears a name tag." The post spread fast, and then came the first open act of solidarity. A businessman in a tailored gray suit who had been silent through the ordeal rose from his seat. He stepped into the aisle, turned toward the Carters, and addressed Danielle. "I saw what happened," he said, voice low but steady. "I should have spoken up sooner. I didn't. I was complicit. I'm sorry." Danielle turned to him. "Thank you," she replied, and nothing more. Because that was enough. The man bowed his head and returned to his seat. Elijah leaned over and whispered to her, "It's starting." She nodded once. Moments later, a flight attendant, not Rachel, approached them cautiously, holding a small white envelope. "This just came through from corporate," she said. "It's for you, Mrs. Carter." Danielle opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single printed sheet with the Westward Airlines seal at the top. It wasn't a formal apology. Not yet. It was something more unnerving. "We are initiating an in-flight incident review under the CEO's direction. Immediate administrative leave has been issued to the crew member in question upon landing. We request a meeting with you and your husband upon arrival." Elijah let out a small breath. "They're scrambling," he said. Danielle folded the letter and placed it into her purse, her movements deliberate. "Let them." In the boardroom below, Malcolm Reed received a call on his line. He picked up, expecting corporate legal. Instead, it was Sheldon Grant, the on-ground executive at JFK. "Malcolm," Sheldon said, voice tight, "there's press at the gate already. Officers are on standby. And I just received word that the captain called in an in-flight protocol deviation. He overrode a crew member's decision. That hasn't happened in over a decade." Malcolm exhaled. "Get the legal language ready. We need a statement. Transparent, fast, and with teeth." Sheldon paused. "What about Elijah?" Malcolm looked at the screen where Danielle's words were frozen mid-sentence. "Offer him the meeting, and hope he still wants one." Back on the plane, the sun was beginning to set through the windows, casting soft orange light across Danielle's cheekbones. She sat with her hand resting lightly on Leah's, while Miles leaned against Elijah's shoulder, his eyes fluttering in and out of sleep. It looked from a distance like any family on a long-haul flight, but beneath the surface it was something else entirely. It was a family that had been humiliated, had been forced to prove their place, and had decided, together, not to stay quiet. As Flight 407 descended through layers of pink and gold dusk, the hush that had settled over the cabin remained unbroken. But it was no longer the hush of discomfort. It was the quiet before accountability. The cabin lights dimmed, seat belts clicked, and Rachel Foster remained frozen in her jump seat near the rear galley, hands clenched tightly on her lap. Her headset buzzed softly with the captain's final announcement, but the words blurred. She couldn't hear anything over the sound of her pulse pounding in her ears. She knew what waited for her beyond the jet bridge. Not turbulence, but reckoning. In first class, Danielle gently straightened Leah's hair with her fingers, while Miles stirred beside Elijah, stretching sleepily. The boy blinked toward the window as the lights of the airport began to dot the horizon. "Are we home yet?" he whispered. Elijah smiled faintly. Almost, but this wasn't just a landing. It was an arrival into a moment that would ripple far beyond them. Danielle reached into her purse and retrieved the corporate memo again. Her thumb brushed the seal at the top. It still didn't carry an apology, just a precaution, panic in polite language. "They're not sorry," she said under her breath, barely audible to Elijah. "They're afraid." "And they should be," he replied calmly. "This is no longer just a flight error. It's a mirror they can't look away from." The tires hit the runway with a soft thud. A collective breath was released through the plane, but no one stood. Everyone knew the real descent was still coming. On the ground, the arrival gate buzzed, not with boarding calls, but with murmurs, phones raised, and security teams in place. Uniformed officers flanked the glass door leading to the jet bridge. A man in a dark suit with an airline operations badge stood stiffly with a folded tablet in one hand and a crisis protocol envelope in the other. His name was Mr. Nolan Price, Senior Liaison for Corporate Ethics at Westward Holdings. He wasn't there to greet passengers. He was there to clean up a mess already spiraling out of control. Back on board, the final chime rang. The captain's voice broke through the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to John F. Kennedy International Airport. For those of you who witnessed today's events, we want to assure you that what occurred is being addressed with the seriousness it demands. We thank you for your patience, your civility, and your courage." A pause. "Cabin crew, doors to arrival and cross-check." Rachel's eyes welled. The words were neutral, professional. But she knew they weren't meant as reassurance. They were a warning. The door opened with a pressurized hiss. Two security officers stepped aboard first. Not loud, not aggressive, just present. Then came Mr. Price. He approached the front of the cabin and said in a calm, unmistakable voice, "Ms. Foster, you're to come with us." Passengers turned. Some gasped. Rachel rose, legs stiff, eyes fixed ahead. She straightened her blazer as if it could restore what had already unraveled. Elijah watched her quietly. Danielle didn't look at her at all. Rachel stepped off the plane without protest. Her name tag no longer seemed to carry any weight. As the rest of the passengers gathered their belongings, many paused at the Carter's row. Some offered nods, others quite thankful. A young woman in a blue cardigan knelt briefly beside Danielle and whispered, "You made us all braver." Danielle smiled gently but said nothing. Ava Morgan, the junior flight attendant, waited until the last passengers had exited before approaching with slow, careful steps. She knelt slightly to their eye level. "Mrs. Carter, Mr. Carter, if there's anything your family needs before disembarking, I'll personally see to it." Danielle's eyes softened. "Thank you, Ava, for everything. I saw you." Ava swallowed hard. "I saw you too." They exchanged no further words, just a look heavy with meaning. Outside the aircraft, the glow of the terminal spilled into the night. Mr. Price stood beside an open door leading into a private reception suite normally reserved for dignitaries. He offered a slight bow as Elijah and Danielle stepped through with their children in tow. Leah clung to Danielle's hand. Miles carried his backpack with both straps tight across his chest, standing as tall as he could. Inside the suite, silence again. Then Mr. Price spoke. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, I won't waste your time. We failed today, in public, and on record." Elijah nodded. "I'm aware." Mr. Price offered the envelope. "This contains a formal acknowledgement of the incident, along with a draft of a public statement. However, before anything moves forward, we want to hear from you." Danielle opened the envelope slowly, scanned the first lines, then handed it back. "This isn't about us anymore," she said. "It's about the people watching, the ones who've been moved from seats they paid for, denied meals they requested, treated like shadows in cabins they helped build." She turned to Elijah. "Do they want the truth or a headline?" Elijah replied, "Let's give them both." Back at home that night, as lights blinked across the skyline and media outlets pushed out urgent stories about the Carter incident, Danielle tucked Leah and Miles into bed. "I don't want you to be scared," she whispered to them. "I want you to be proud." Leah nodded sleepily. "They can't move you again, right, Mama?" Danielle kissed her forehead. "Not without all of us moving together." The morning after Flight 407 made headlines across the country, Danielle Carter awoke to find her name on every major news outlet, but not as a victim, as a voice. Her speech, recorded in crisp clarity by three passengers and shared across platforms, had struck a national nerve. Not because it was theatrical, or angry, or tearful, but because it was undeniable. The moment she stood, she said, "My seat was paid for, my presence was challenged, and my dignity was not negotiable." The internet responded not with noise, but with resonance. It was, as one journalist on a morning panel remarked, the kind of quiet power that exposes everything without having to raise its voice. Danielle wasn't watching the broadcast. She was in her kitchen, sipping tea in a worn university hoodie, her phone buzzing nonstop on the table. Emails from law schools, invitations from civil rights foundations. A note from a pastor in Atlanta who wanted to replay her video at Sunday service. Leah sat at the breakfast counter, drawing airplanes with colored pencils. One had smiling passengers. Another had a mother and daughter seated together with a crown floating above them. Danielle smiled faintly and gently kissed the top of her daughter's head. Elsewhere, in a boardroom tinted by sleeplessness and damage control, the fallout continued. Rachel Foster sat stiffly across from a panel of three executives, none of them smiling. The airline's internal review had begun. HR, legal, brand risk, the works. She looked different now. No blazer, no makeup, no certainty, just regret and the weight of exposure. "Miss Foster," one of the board members began, "we've received the complete manifest logs, passenger records, crew testimonies, security footage, and, of course, the now viral passenger video. Do you have anything to say before we proceed?" Rachel's hands trembled as she folded them over her lap. "I made a judgment call," she said. "No," another board member interjected. "You made an assumption. You moved a mother away from her children without verifying facts. You didn't question protocol. You imposed your own." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. "I didn't mean to humiliate her," she whispered. "But you did." The words hung in the air like fog, and now the entire world knows it. Meanwhile, across the country, in a quiet hotel conference room in Washington, D.C., Elijah Carter reviewed a different kind of document, a draft resolution, not from the airline, but from the National Ethics in Aviation Coalition, a bipartisan group of industry leaders, civil rights attorneys, and policy strategists. In light of the Carter incident, they had invited Elijah and Danielle to co-author a new Passenger Equity and Dignity Act, a reform package that would mandate training, implement anonymous complaint tracking, and require verified justification for in-flight seat changes. Elijah stared at the title printed in bold letters, "The Carter Protocol." He didn't smile, not because he wasn't proud, but because this should have existed before Danielle ever had to rise from her seat. Danielle joined him minutes later, a soft rustle in her step, her expression unreadable. "They want us to speak," she said. Elijah didn't need to ask who they were. The coalition, the press, the public, the people who had suddenly remembered they had ears. "At the summit next week," she added, "in front of flight executives from every major airline in the country." Elijah stood and walked over. "Are you ready for that?" She paused, then met his eyes. "I was ready the moment she told me to move." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll speak." Days later, inside the luminous rotunda of the National Aviation Leadership Forum, Danielle Carter stood behind a microphone. Her image was broadcast onto twin screens. Her voice reaches thousands in real time, and this time, no one could move her. She wore a midnight blue suit, minimal jewelry, and a quiet strength that made every row sit straighter. Elijah stood just to the side, arms folded loosely. Miles and Leah were seated with a small group of families behind them. Danielle began, "I didn't come here to relive a painful day. I came here to ask a question that should never need asking. Why do people who look like me still have to prove we belong in the seats we've already paid for?" There was no sound in the room. No family should have to brace themselves for disrespect before the plane leaves the gate. No child should watch their mother be removed in silence and wonder what she did wrong. No airline should operate under the illusion that luxury entitles some passengers to dignity while others are asked to step aside quietly. She took a breath. And no system, no matter how polished, should be allowed to treat bias as a glitch, when it is in fact a feature that must be dismantled. A beat of silence, then applause. Not thunderous, but rising, rolling. From the back of the room forward, it wasn't a standing ovation for drama, it was an acknowledgement of truth. Back in New York, Rachel Foster received a letter by courier. Suspension, indefinite, pending full investigation. But what struck her wasn't the paperwork. It was the final line typed in bold. We are entering a new era, one where silence will not protect us and assumptions will not excuse us. She sat with the letter in her lap for a long time, and for the first time in years, she questioned everything she had learned about control, service, and who was worth listening to. In the Carter home that evening, Danielle placed a new letter inside a wooden box tucked neatly under her bookshelf. Inside the box were dozens more, handwritten notes from strangers, students, mothers, travelers. Notes that began with words like, "Thank you for your courage," and "I saw myself in your story." She closed the lid gently and whispered, "Let's keep going." Elijah entered, holding a draft of their upcoming op-ed for The Atlantic. "It's good," he said, "but they want to run it with a new title?" Danielle raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" He smiled softly. She belonged there. The ripple effect had begun, not with grand speeches, not even with press conferences, but with letters, emails, messages scribbled on lined paper and napkins, typing in classrooms, whispered in hallways. Danielle Carter had become a name people remembered, not because she shouted, but because she didn't, because she stood, spoke, sat back down, and refused to be erased. In the weeks following her summit speech, the Carter family became the quiet center of a national conversation, one not fueled by outrage alone, but by reflection. The Carter Protocol, still under review in the Senate Subcommittee on Transportation, had already inspired 2 regional airlines to preemptively implement their version, including mandatory bias training for flight crews, anonymous in-flight misconduct reporting, and a cross-check system for seat reassignments. It was a beginning, not enough, but real. One chilly afternoon, as autumn leaves painted the sidewalks of Manhattan, Danielle received a package at her door. Hand-delivered, no return address. Inside was a small weathered envelope in a single-page letter. She unfolded it slowly, reading the first line aloud. "Dear Mrs. Carter, you don't know me. I know you saved me from a ghost I've been carrying for 22 years. Danielle sat down, letting the words settle before continuing. In 2003, I was 14 years old. My mother and I boarded a flight from Houston to Chicago. She was soft-spoken, beautifully dressed, and holding 2 first-class tickets. The agent at the gate smiled tightly and said there had been a change. Only 1 seat was available. She told me to go ahead, that she'd be fine. I remember her standing behind the curtain, alone, while I sat surrounded by strangers in silence. I didn't understand it then. I thought maybe we were the mistake. I never forgot how she smiled to protect me. Your story let me finally cry about it. It let me stop blaming her, or myself. It was signed, Alina Reyes, Brooklyn, NY. Danielle folded the letter and pressed her palm over her chest, not to quiet the ache, but to honor it, because that ache had connected them across time, across silence, across shame. That same week, Elijah received a call from Senator Dana Wexler, chair of the Aviation Oversight Subcommittee. Her voice, firm but kind, asked if he would testify alongside Danielle when the Carter Protocol entered formal legislative debate. Elijah paused. He hadn't sought politics, had never imagined standing at a podium beside elected officials and policymakers. But he looked across the room where Danielle sat rereading Alina's letter under the late afternoon light. And he knew. They weren't here just to heal. They were here to build. I'll be there, he said. Inside the corridors of Westward Airlines headquarters, sweeping changes had already begun. It started with something small, name tags redesigned, no longer listing only first names, but also displaying the crew member's service pledge in tiny print, a sentence selected by each employee and approved through training, something they had to say out loud before wearing the uniform. Rachel Foster's desk, once neatly stacked with flight schedules and performance reports, now sat empty. Her suspension remained in effect. Her review is ongoing. But her absence was not seen as punishment. It was a lesson. One echoed in every employee retraining session, now conducted under a new directive called See Me, Acknowledge Before You Act. It was Ava Morgan, the once silent junior flight attendant, who helped design the name. She had seen, she had remembered, and now she wanted to make sure others did too. In a sunlit community center in Harlem, Danielle stepped onto a modest stage for her first grassroots town hall, hosted not by a major network, but by a coalition of mothers, teachers, and transit workers. She didn't speak from behind a podium. She sat in a chair, in a circle, among them. A teacher spoke first. They told me I was too emotional when I asked why black boys always got seated at the back of the classroom. A nurse followed. They call it protocol, but it always seems to apply more heavily to us. Danielle listened, and when she finally spoke, she said, "You're not here because of what happened to me on that plane. You're here because it reminded you of what's happened to you. In banks, at the gates, in interviews, in lunchrooms, in silence, and now we've seen each other, and we can't unsee it." The room didn't erupt. It exhaled, because someone had finally named what they had carried. Back at home that night, Danielle stood by the window with Leah in her arms. The little girl had fallen asleep after another long day filled with questions from classmates, a teacher's shy thank you, and a poem she'd written about a sky that doesn't hurt anymore. Danielle whispered into her hair, "I'm proud of you." Behind her, Elijah tapped softly on the doorframe. He was holding a press release. "They're naming the new leadership initiative after you," he said. "The board approved it today. It's called," he held out the paper, "the Danielle Carter Fellowship for Ethics in Aviation Leadership." Danielle blinked, then smiled, not for the honor, but for what it meant. Somewhere on a late-night red-eye, a flight attendant reached for the intercom and paused, remembering the training from just 2 weeks ago. She looked again at the manifest, saw the name, saw the person, and then walked down the aisle not with suspicion, but with welcome. Because the flight was different now, because someone had stood and refused to be moved. The hearing room inside the Westward Airlines Internal Ethics Committee headquarters was nothing like a courtroom. No gavel, no judge's bench, no jury box. But it felt like one. The air was taut, clean, heavy. A long conference table sat at the center. At one end, Danielle and Elijah Carter. At the other end, Rachel Foster, seated with her hands folded tightly in front of her. Between them, truth, accountability, and the uncomfortable space where stories collide with consequences. Danielle wore navy, simple, elegant, no makeup beyond a muted lip, no need to perform. Elijah, by her side, sat still, silent, a lighthouse of quiet resolve. Rachel, for once, didn't wear the airline uniform. No wing pin, no structured blazer. She looked smaller somehow, like someone whose world had shrunk to the size of a moment she couldn't undo. Across the room, 3 members of the ethics committee reviewed files silently, screens blinking before them. The lead investigator, a seasoned woman named Eleanor Kim, finally looked up. "We're not here to punish you," she said, her voice even. "We're here to understand and to begin the process of change that your actions demanded." Rachel nodded once. It was the first time she hadn't tried to defend herself. Eleanor turned to Danielle. "Mrs. Carter, you have the floor." Danielle stood slowly, paper in hand, though she didn't glance at it once. "I came here today not to relive what happened on that plane," she began, "but to remind this committee and Ms. Foster of what was truly taken that day." She took a breath, steady, grounded. "I wasn't removed from a seat. I was removed from my child's side in front of her, without cause, without apology, and without anyone raising a hand to stop it." Rachel's eyes flickered, but she didn't speak. Danielle's tone sharpened, not angry, but precise. "It wasn't just about me. It was about the message that moment sent to everyone watching. That authority doesn't need a reason. That courtesy is conditional. That dignity is negotiable." She paused. "I am here to say it isn't." There was no applause, only quiet. Danielle sat, and the room breathed differently. Outside the building, cameras clicked and microphones bristled as journalists waited. The hearing wasn't public, But word had spread. And in the digital age, silence never stayed confined. In classrooms, in union halls, in break rooms across America, people watched. Not just the outcome, but how it unfolded. Inside, Eleanor turned to Rachel Foster. "You may respond, Miss Foster." Rachel stood slowly. Her voice trembled at first. "I thought I was following procedure," she began. "That's what I told myself. That's what I told my crew. But I didn't verify the manifest. I didn't question my instinct. I assumed." She looked down, ashamed. "And when I saw you," she glanced at Danielle, then away, "I made a decision based on a story I'd already written in my head about who belonged and who didn't." Her voice cracked. "I was wrong. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't enough. But it was real. I've watched that video every night since. Not because I was forced to, but because I needed to understand what it felt like. To be asked to leave a space you earned just because someone couldn't imagine you there." Danielle didn't move. Rachel continued. "You showed grace I didn't deserve, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I will carry this with me, and I will teach others to do better, because silence doesn't protect anyone anymore." The board recessed briefly. When they returned, Eleanor's words were simple. "Ms. Foster, your conduct violated company code and ethical expectations. Your reinstatement is denied. However, pending completion of the new See Me initiative as a public trainee, not as staff, you may reapply to work in a different division." Rachel's eyes welled, but she nodded. Not in protest, in understanding. Danielle and Elijah stood. The moment was done, but the message was just beginning. Later that night, back in Washington, D.C., the Carter Protocol was finally brought to the Senate floor. The gallery overflowed, reporters pressed against the glass, staffers scribbled, and citizens from every walk of life filled the seats, many of them people who had never cared about aviation policy before. Now they did, because this wasn't about altitude, it was about access, about who was seen and who was silent. Senator Dana Wexler stood at the podium, voice strong. "For too long, discrimination has flown under the radar, casual, quiet, and unchallenged. What happened to Danielle Carter is not isolated. It is institutional, it is preventable, and now it must be corrected." She gestured to Danielle and Elijah, seated behind her. "Because of their courage, the Carter Protocol will ensure that no passenger is ever removed from a seat without a verified reason, that all in-flight crew undergo quarterly bias training, that passengers may report discriminatory treatment anonymously before landing, and that oversight is no longer internal only, but public." Applause echoed through the chamber. Danielle held Elijah's hand. Miles and Leah, watching from a quiet room nearby, clapped too, because they understood now, not just what had happened, but why did it matter. Back in New York, Rachel Foster sat alone in a community training room. The words, "See me, acknowledge before you act," blinked on a digital screen in front of her. She looked around the room, full of people in gray vests and flight pins. People like her. People who now had to unlearn what they'd been taught. A new instructor entered, and it wasn't a corporate VP, it was Ava Morgan, the junior flight attendant, now promoted to lead trainer for the See Me initiative. Rachel's face flushed. Ava met her eyes and said, "Welcome, let's begin." And for the first time, Rachel listened, not to defend herself, but to change. 3 months after Flight 407, the skies felt different. It wasn't the airplanes. It was the people boarding them. At boarding gates, small signs now stood at every counter, displaying 5 simple words. "See me, then seat me." Passengers glanced at them with quiet curiosity. Flight crews read them before each shift. And somewhere in the small print on every staff badge, one policy line had become standard. Every seat has a name, and every name has a story. That story had a face. Her name was Danielle Carter. The day the Carter Protocol was officially signed into federal aviation policy, Danielle stood at a podium flanked by Elijah, Leah, and Miles. A sea of onlookers filled the atrium of the Department of Transportation in Washington, D.C., where history was not being rewritten, but corrected. The Secretary of Transportation smiled warmly as he presented the commemorative folder to her. "You didn't just keep your seat," he said. You made sure no one else would lose theirs unjustly again. Danielle accepted the document, but her words were for the audience. I'm grateful for this, she began softly. But I didn't do it for a law. I did it for a little girl on a plane who thought her mother didn't belong, and for the thousands who never got to return to their seats. She turned slightly toward her daughter. This is for you, Leah. Leah grinned and squeezed her hand tightly. At Westward Airlines headquarters, the internal walls were different now too. Not just posters or policy plaques, but a new addition just past the main entrance. A gallery wall named the Acknowledgement Hall. Framed in the center was a large photo of Danielle Carter returning to her first-class seat, captured by a passenger's phone mid-frame. Her expression was unreadable, composed, but her posture said everything. Beneath it, etched in brass, because dignity isn't something you earn, it's something you carry, whether others see it or not. The wall wasn't there for decoration, it was a mirror, and every employee passed it before clocking in. Rachel Foster stood in front of that mirror for the first time on a rainy Tuesday morning. Her hands clutched the hem of her coat. She didn't wear a badge anymore. She had not reapplied, but she had completed her full 6-week CME training. Twice. And today, she stood not as a staff member, but as a guest speaker for a group of new hires. Her role was clear: not to explain, not to defend, but to admit. To recognize the moment I failed, she told the group, and to ensure you never do. Ava Morgan stood at the back of the room, arms folded, not with judgment, but with quiet assurance. People can change when they're willing to see. Back in Harlem, Danielle returned to the same community center where she once sat in a circle of mothers, janitors, and nurses. This time, she wasn't there to speak. She was there to listen. The Carter story had spread into neighborhoods, into schools, into the hands of teenage girls who now use their voices without trembling, and into one project born from Danielle's vision, the Flight Forward Initiative, a nonprofit that provides scholarships for young women of color entering aviation, transportation, and public policy. One of the first recipients was a young woman named Alina Reyes, the same girl who once wrote Danielle about a mother forced to stand behind the curtain. Now she stood on a small stage and said, "You gave me my mother back. Now I want to give this world better runways." Danielle cried. So did Elijah, because the legacy was no longer theoretical. It had wings. At JFK Airport's Terminal C, Gate 47, a new plaque was installed on the wall. It was a seat preserved in glass, the actual seat from row 2B of Flight 407. Below it read, "This seat was taken, then returned, and with it, a nation's voice," in honor of Danielle Carter. Passengers stopped to read it, often mid-boarding, tears rising before they even buckled their belts. It reminded them that flying isn't just about where you land, but how you're treated along the way. That night at home, Danielle and Elijah sat on their back porch, wrapped in soft blankets, their children asleep upstairs. Planes blinked silently across the sky overhead. Danielle took a deep breath, leaned her head on Elijah's shoulder. "You know," she said softly, "when she told me to move that day, I wasn't surprised." Elijah didn't respond immediately. She turned to him. "But what surprised me," she continued, "was how many people stood after I sat back down." Elijah looked at her, smiled gently. "Because sometimes," he said, "you don't need to roar to start a revolution. You just need to hold your ground." They sat in silence, the quiet of the world around them laced with peace and purpose. Danielle's eyes lingered on the sky, on the lights, the motion, the endless hush above. "Do you think the skies will stay this way?" she asked. Elijah responded without hesitation. "They will, as long as someone like you is watching." Epilogue. Weeks later, Danielle received one final letter, this time handwritten, elegant, folded with care. "Mrs. Carter, I was the woman sitting 2 rows behind you on Flight 407. I didn't speak. I didn't record. I just watched. And I've regretted my silence every day since. But because of you, I've started speaking in other places, at work, at home, in rooms where I used to stay quiet. Thank you for showing us that stillness is not weakness. It's resistance, and it moves mountains. With gratitude, CM." Danielle closed the letter and smiled, because in the end, what they tried to take wasn't just her seat, it was her place in the story, and now it was hers forever. Moral of the story: this story is not just about a woman being removed from her seat. It's about what happens when quiet dignity meets unjust authority and refuses to bow. Danielle Carter did not shout. She did not retaliate. She stood in grace, spoke in truth, and reminded the world that dignity is not something that can be reassigned. Her silence was not weakness. It was power, a power that exposed the quiet systems of discrimination that thrive when no one is watching, and dismantled them when someone finally did. The lesson is simple but profound. Do not assume. Do not stay silent. Every person deserves to be seen, respected, and heard, regardless of what they look like, where they sit, or how softly they speak. Justice doesn't always arrive in thunder. Sometimes it begins with one woman refusing to move, and because of her, the sky is now a little fairer for everyone.